Okay, so we'll get started. So thank you all for coming to this session. I'm Kirk Roberts, and I'm going to give a brief overview of a shared task or challenge that we conducted under BioCaddy, which we called the 2016 BioCaddy Dataset Retrieval Challenge. So the first 2 bullet points of this slide is sort of preaching to the choir here. As we have more and more data in biomedicine, and it becomes more and more important to scientific research, that's a good thing, but on the flip side, actually finding relevant data can be problematic. And so if you start to think about it in terms of a search engine, which falls under the field of information retrieval, this provides a really natural mechanism to find relevant data sets amidst all that are available. But what's not quite fully known or characterized is how information retrieval for data sets differs from sort of the normal pre-existing types of information retrieval. So web search, information retrieval for scientific articles, these are fairly well understood things, but data set retrieval is sort of a new field. So one of the things we want to investigate is how this really differs from probably the closest thing, which is biomedical literature retrieval. And a great way to do this is to conduct a shared task or a challenge. So a bit of brief history in terms of shared tasks that have been done in information retrieval. Most of these have happened under the aegis of the TREC, or Text Retrieval Conference. It's a series of workshops over the years organized by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And it's not biomedicine related at all, but there's been a series of tracks that have probably, let's see, now there's usually about 8 tracks per year, and there's usually 1, or in this case, I guess, sort of 1.5 tracks that are biomedicine related. But historically, the 4 sort of main ones that have been done, or the genomics track organized by Bill Hirsch, and that was targeted towards genomic researchers searching over biomedical literature data. The medical records track searched over electronic health record notes, and it was very popular, except HIPAA seemed to get in the way, and so they had to cancel that track. The clinical decision support track then actually brought the target from researchers to clinicians to try to get clinicians to better use biomedical literature. And then this year, the first case of the precision medicine track, which I run, just completed a couple days ago, and that's sort of an instance of clinical decision support, but specifically targeting this one use case of precision medicine to get oncologists better access to biomedical literature for cancer patients, and getting them access to clinical trials. So the point of the slide is there's a long history of using challenges and shared tasks to kind of help get a good sense of the field in information retrieval. So the purpose of this specific challenge, we wanted to investigate and encourage research in data set retrieval. And it's usually a very good way if you give people a short deadline to encourage some very rapid development of new methods and to quickly get other types of methods that have been integrated elsewhere, get them into this particular task. It comes with, we created a publicly available benchmark so that even work on this data, this type of retrieval can continue well beyond this particular challenge. That it's a publicly available data set that people can use, and I'll talk about it a little bit. And then the other thing that a challenge can do is it can disseminate ideas and encourage research. And finally, as sort of a nice side effect, we sort of thought of the challenge as a way to kind of crowdsource a set of feature ideas for improvement of DataMed. So there were a lot of people involved in this. We had an organizing committee mostly consisting of people at UT Health. We brought in 2 sort of people who weren't directly involved in BioCaddy, but have a lot of involvement in organizing shared tasks. So Dina Demner-Fushman at NLM and Bill Hirsch at OHSU. And then we roped in some of the steering committee and some others to help evaluate some of the submissions. So the basic idea behind, okay, well I had a nice animation, but it's okay. So the basic idea behind any of our, in general, information retrieval challenges is you have a corpus and you have ideally some sample queries that you can provide participants and some test queries which will be sort of the official queries on which their systems will be evaluated. And initially you simply provide them with a corpus and some sample queries so they can have some months to develop their system. And then right before the end of the challenge, you provide them with the test queries so they don't have much time. They're not allowed to look at them. They're not allowed to sort of overly tune their system on these test queries. And they use those to retrieve a set of results. And then these results are what we can actually empirically evaluate. So the corpus consisted of just shy of 800,000 data sets from 20 repositories. So it's sort of it was a snapshot of what was in the DataMed index right before the start of the challenge. So it's obviously, there's more stuff there now, but the data sets were provided to participants in both an XML and JSON format. And I generally think of each of these, each data set as consisting of some structured data, so IDs and timestamps and some sort of data set specific structured data as well as some unstructured data, which is probably more analogous to what we're used to in information retrieval. And then I would sort of separate publication information, which is you could view as either structured or unstructured, but it's sort of a separate way of providing some information, which then some participants could go out and retrieve those publications and use that as further information. So this is just a quick screenshot of one of the data sets, and a lot of you have looked at things that look a lot like this, but here this description is probably closer to what most information retrieval researchers are used to dealing with, and how they can incorporate all the other metadata is kind of part of the challenge. So the queries that we used, it started with a part of working group 3, which is a process I wasn't really involved in, but there were some use cases from stakeholders which evolved into some competency questions and some query templates. And from these, there was a set of queries that were sort of instantiated queries, and I think there were several dozen of these that could act as potential queries for the task. Then 6 of these were sort of used as a way to train our assessors, our judges, and to come to a sort of a standard for how we can actually evaluate systems. But there was sort of a pre-assessment work, and those were used as the sample queries with manual judgments and provided to the participants. Then we had 15 test queries where we did both what is a pre-assessment where we had baseline systems retrieve a lot of potential results, and the assessors sort of judged each one of them individually. And then we did a post-submission assessment as well. It's where we took data sets that had not been judged in the initial assessment but were returned at a high rank by the participants. So things that probably were sort of missed maybe in the initial work, and those were judged as well. So just as sort of an example of some of the queries, and you can read them here. I won't demonstrate my ability to mispronounce words, but they cover a lot of different, from a lot of different of the data sets that are indexed in DataMed. But they're also fairly templated, I guess you could say. So to some extent, a lot of the words in a lot of these queries were predominantly ignored by the systems because they don't necessarily add a lot of semantic information to it. So the three main metrics that we use to evaluate each of the systems empirically, and these were taken from what's commonly used in the TREC task. So inferred average precision, inferred normalized discounted cumulative gain, and precision at 10. I won't go into sort of the detailed theoretical ideas behind these, but just to explain what is meant by inferred. So in a typical information retrieval metric, it assumes that all of the results are judged. Either this is relevant, this is not relevant, or on some scale. But that's when you're doing a challenge and you can't possibly judge every single result. You kind of have to have a way of inferring what the result would be on a particular data set. And so that's what these inferred measures are. They use some sampling techniques to be able to estimate what the actual average precision or the actual NDCG would be had all of the results been judged. The precision at 10 doesn't need to infer because we guaranteed that up to 10 all top 10 results were judged. So there was no need to infer anything there. So even though we had a fairly tight timeline, we still got participation from 10 separate teams, which is pretty good. Because of the timeline, we couldn't really integrate this into the normal TREC process, which is a very long, basically a year and a half worth of work. But instead, we kind of squeezed this into under 6 months. But saying that, we still got a fairly good participation. And most teams submitted up to the 5 maximum number of runs. So as I said, that the timeline was fairly short. We did an announcement, I think in August of 2016. The actual corpus and sample queries were available in mid-September. And so they had from mid-September until mid-November to actually work on their systems. And actually, I guess they could work on it a little bit later than that as well. And then on September, whenever they actually downloaded the test queries, then they had to sort of freeze their systems, run them on those test queries, and then submit by the December 2nd deadline. So the results from the various systems, I'll just highlight the top in each of the categories. You can, just for clarification, the precision at 10 plus P, we actually had a 3-point scale where there was a result was not relevant, partially relevant, or fully relevant. And something like NDCG allows you to actually incorporate that 3-point scale into the ranking, into the metric itself. But for precision, this just includes the partially relevant as if they were fully relevant, and minus P means that the partially relevant were considered irrelevant, which is why this column is substantially higher. Another thing to sort of note is that the teams that did well, there's some correlation between the different metrics, but not an awful lot. And this is something that we noticed in a lot of information retrieval systems. And so it's not that unexpected, but just for a bit of intuition, precision at 10 is essentially a metric that says these top 10 and ignore everything else. The top 10 are the only thing you care about. Whether you get something that's relevant at number 9 or number 1 doesn't really matter, but just sort of take the top 10, shuffle them up, and see how many relevant you have there. Whereas something like NDCG really measures the long tail. So, NDCG is going to actually say, well, getting something at number 12, that's still good, but it's also going to say getting something at number 568, that's still good too. It's not going to give as much weight to number 568 as it's going to give to number 12, but it measures sort of the long tail of results, which might or might not be useful depending upon your use case. So they kind of have different, the different metrics sort of depending upon how you think the system should be used. One metric might be more appropriate than another. But At the time, we weren't exactly sure, so we just went with just a grab bag full of metrics. So a bit of a discussion first before I get to the subcontract, subaward that we did. These are sort of my opinions, but I would say that the results were pretty good given that this is really the first attempt at a data set retrieval shared task. Normally when we do Trek tasks, and it's sort of the first instance of a Trek task, the first year the results are terrible, and they sort of improve year over year as people kind of get used to exactly what the challenges are in that particular type of information retrieval. So I think that given that it was really the first offering, I think the results were quite good. And their number of participation, I think, was pretty good too, given the short time scale and given the fact that this was offered outside of Trek. On the flip side, a lot of the systems largely resemble sort of standard document retrieval methods. They do include some more sort of state-of-the-art retrieval methods, but things that were essentially just ported from more traditional types of information retrieval. This is not that much of a surprise. If you don't give people an awful lot of time, they're not going to be able to come up with extremely novel things. But the fact that they were able to actually take some fairly state-of-the-art information retrieval methods and port it over to data set retrieval was fairly promising, I think. One problem we ran into is that the judgments we provided up front for the 6 sample queries weren't that reliable. This is sort of, we kind of knew that they weren't going to be that reliable. They were the judgments that we used in order to kind of come to an agreement, a standard between the annotators on what's relevant and what's not relevant. So it was sort of their kind of first attempts. And then the flip side of this is some of the participants heavily relied on these sample judgments to do things like machine learning, and it gets to the point where if you can easily over-rely on something that's not necessarily very reliable, then that can kind of backfire. Just a sort of a brief overview of some of the methods that some of the participants tried using. There were actually several. Almost all of the participants tried to do some form of query expansion, but some of them tried using some neural word embeddings, which is fairly new, and character embeddings. There were some learning to rank approaches, and we're going to hear from one of them as Emory did that. There were some query to data set similarity metrics that people came up with, and some ways to kind of, in an a priori fashion, determine what repository is more appropriate for the query. So sort of a repository level scoring as opposed to just purely data set level scoring. And finally, there were some ways to sort of unify queries and data sets. So like the UniProt classification is sort of has a good set of classes that can be used to sort of say, this is the type of data set and this is the type of query. This is the type of data set the query is looking for, and if you apply that to all the data sets, then you can get improved results. Just really quickly, just the subcontract, we had the 10 participants, 9 of them submitted a system description. 2 of the 9, the UCSD and OHSU, were not eligible for the subcontract. So of the 7 that were left, our sort of committee did a kind of a peer review type process where we scored each of the 7 according to its relevance to BioCaddy, the strength of the technology, the plan for actually integrating that into DataMed, the innovativeness, and the ranking of the challenge. It would be nice if we lived in a world where the empirical score that was given to a team was all that really mattered. Unfortunately, that's just not quite the way it works, and the people who run Trek, they don't even like to declare winners in Trek. They'll sort of, we'll put here are the top scores, and then they'll quickly move on to the next slide, because the main idea is more just to get ideas out there and to sort of have some framework to compare empirically than to sort of have winners. And so in our case, the subcontract winners wasn't simply based on their ranking in the challenge, but based on some of the ideas and how well we felt those could improve data med. Some teams had some really high-ranking systems, but they didn't do anything particularly exciting, and so there's no sense in giving a subcontract if there's not really much that can be translated. So the top 3 were selected, and Elsevier declined, and so Emory and UIUC were the 2 teams awarded a subcontract. So just very briefly, and while I mention this, we have a special issue of database, the journal database that's dedicated towards this challenge, and the organizers have 2 different papers in this special issue. The first is an overview, which is pretty similar to what I've just presented here, and then there's another paper that dives a lot deeper into what's in the benchmark data set. The participants were all invited to submit. I don't really know at the moment how many did or how many have been accepted or anything like that, but I know a lot of them have contacted me and mentioned things about that. So, and there are several that have actually been accepted already. So the special issue should be complete sometime this fall. All right, thank you, and I don't know if I have much time for questions, but.